Chapter 31. He fell less than 2 meters, but one of his boots went straight through the HVAC deck. He pulled it back and shined his lights down the duct. The tunnel continued for the length of the module, his lights fading into the deep shadows some 30 meters away. Zilf crouch-walked 2 meters from the hole in the HVAC tunnel, grabbed his bolt gun, and waited. It didn't take long for his would-be assailant to drop through the open panel, two of the malformed alien thing's legs catching on the edge of the ragged hole his boot had made. Green liquid gushed, and the creature's silent scream echoed from memory. It turned its head, searching for him, and found his wrench instead. The heavy tool crashed into the side of the thing's skull, knocking the head to one side and exposing its neck. He plunged the bolt gun into the folds of chitin and pulled the trigger once. The creature shuddered, its upper arms scrabbling and pulling at his tool arm. He pulled the trigger 2 more times and the creature stopped moving, streams of liquid running down its body. He hit its skull once more with the wrench, and it tore partly free from a network of what looked like tendon and muscle. That wasn't good enough. He hit it again and the head fell to the steel, his mind adding the sound of a wet squelch. He didn't know if another one was coming, but thought it likely. As lightly as he could, he stepped backward, his eyes flicking between his rear cam and the view in front of him. Zilf saw what he was looking for and grinned. "For once," he said aloud, "I want a damned vent." The glow of ambient light through the vent grating gave him a little hope. At least he might actually be able to see where he was going. He stepped past the grate, making sure his steps were slow and as light as possible, and took up position a meter from it. After waiting a few seconds to make sure nothing else would drop into the HVAC duct, he took a look through the vent. A relieved smile lit his face. A large utility closet lay below, its emergency lights glowing a warm yellow. A rack of quantum computers stood in the corner, floor to ceiling, cooling and power couplings snaking down that side of the wall. Zilf felt a vibration in his boots and quickly looked down the duct. An arm had reached through the hole, found the creature he'd killed, and begun tugging on it. The body rose a centimeter before falling back into the duct, the hole in the duct floor seeming to widen. Another arm joined in the effort, and the alien corpse lifted a full meter off the duct floor. Zilf knew what was coming next and had no interest in being here when it happened. He kicked the grate, and it fell inside the room below, hit the deck floor, and bounced to the side. Zilf carefully positioned himself before dropping down. The 4-meter fall brought a low ache to his skull, but it was tolerable. He just needed to make sure he kept the future acrobatics to a minimum. Zilf turned in a circle, quickly clearing the room and making sure he hadn't missed something. After killing his lights, he rushed to the computer rack and stuffed himself in the corner as best he could. After ejecting the bandolier from the bolt gun, he pulled one of the spare bandoliers and reloaded. 20 seconds had been about right. By then, he was no longer alone. The thing dropped through the opening and hit the deck, making the room quake. It turned in a circle, its thin, multi-jointed legs dancing clumsily beneath it. The thing didn't seem to see him at first, leaving Zilf the barest moment of surprise. He leaped from the corner and swung the wrench at the creature's legs. 3 of the limbs snapped at the upper joints and the creature sagged to one side, a proboscis flicking from its mouth like an enraged jackhammer. Zilf swung again and snapped 2 more of the remaining limbs before shoving the bolt gun into the creature's skull and pulling the trigger 3 times. The thing jerked with each shot, gore geysering from its head and racing down its savage legs. Its proboscis licked the air a few times before the thing completely collapsed, its remaining good leg twitching on the deck. An arm reached through the grate and grabbed Zilf's shoulder, the powerful fingers trying to find purchase on his armor. He yelled in surprise and raised the bolt gun. He fired 3 times, each of the rounds flying into the vent and striking flesh. Green liquid poured out of the vent and the arms rapidly retreated. He had 4 rounds left in the bolt gun, and then he'd be down to his wrench and the nearly empty plasma tool. He whirled, looking for something to keep the thing at bay, saw the power couplings, and grinned ferociously. Zilf quickly reached the server rack, pulled all 3 couplings from the wall, and shoved them upward into the vent. The cables reached high enough to touch the sides, and he punched the live wires into the metal. The liquid dripping from the corners of the vent seemed to jump off the metal, splattering like grease on a hot skillet. Zilf kept the cables pressed there for a full 60 heartbeats before finally lowering them. He half expected the arms to reappear, their owner wounded, pissed off, and far from incapacitated. They didn't. He remained standing there for another half minute before finally dropping the cables to the floor. The status lights on the computer in the lowest rack all flashed red 3 times before they went completely dead. The rest of the computers followed suit. Shit. He realized when he dropped the cables, he'd electrified the floor, the energy traveling through the metal deck, into the rack and frying every circuit. The lights went out in the room. Zilf activated his suit lights, found the hatch, and pressed the release. It swung open, and the suit's external mics picked up the short-lived sound of rushing air. Atmosphere. Sound. A wave of relief washed over him. Instead of reveling in it, he walked through the hatch and slammed it shut behind him. Light. Sound. Great. What wasn't so great? The things on the walls. He stepped into a wide corridor leading to a large cylindrical common area. The alien kudzu covered every available surface in thick, uneven mats. Hundreds of tendrils the size of sausages and the length of a human arm stuck out from the bulkheads and waved idly in the open air, their tapered ends like gossamer fingers. Zilf turned, hoping to find another egress. There wasn't one. The corridor ended in the utility closet, and there wasn't a single hatch back here. He did, however, see the shape of several hatches in the circular room beyond. Even with the flora fauna growing with reckless abandonment, he made out the recesses. 3 hatches, 3 ways out of here. Only problem was the room itself. Dozens of the dung-looking tons rose from the deck in a haphazard scatter. He watched them for movement and shivered when he realized they seemed to be breathing, just like everything else in the large space. He heard the slow wheeze of the room's life forms taking in breath and exhaling in a creepy whisper that sent tingles of fear down his back. Zilf checked the bolt gun, saw the number 4 glaring at him in green, and moved to eject the bandolier before stopping himself. 4 shots left and a reload for his last 10. Another glance at the things in the room beyond, and he forgot about reloading. He couldn't waste a single shot. Alerts on his HUD warned him the atmospheric concentrations of methane and carbon dioxide were far above lethal levels. A single breath might be enough to knock a human unconscious. Luckily, he had plenty of O2 remaining. The reading on his plasma torch, on the other hand, read 4%. He was nearly down to nothing. He had maybe 2 full blasts left, and that wouldn't be enough to take out more than 1 or 2 of the creatures, if they appeared. Who are you kidding? You can't even take down 1. True. Neither he nor Yuri had felled any of the things with a single shot. Bludgeoning them after immobilizing them seemed to be the best strategy. But how did you do that when an entire room was alive? The 10 centimeters of growth covering the deck was no doubt stronger than what he'd stepped through on the level above. The tendrils waving from the deck were at least 3 times the size of the small ones. Fortunately, the larger arms, the ones that looked as though they could have once been human, remained on the bulkheads rather than the obscured deck. An arm coming out of the muck and grabbing his foot wasn't something he wanted to experience. Even after all he'd seen, he was fairly sure he'd freeze and be unable to move. Exhaustion, his father had once said, is when your body tells you to stop, your mind tells you to rest. Your weary soul cannot imagine taking another swim stroke, another kick. In the ocean, you can never afford to be exhausted. Find a reason to keep kicking, keep moving. Do not drown. Do not drown, Zilf muttered. He walked carefully down the corridor, wary of how the thicker tendrils on the deck tried to snare his boots. They didn't offer resistance, however, still not dense enough or maybe massive enough to hold him. The ones on the bulkhead, on the other hand, looked strong enough to lift an unsuited human. If a few of them managed to grab him, he was done for. Methane. CO2. He couldn't even start a damn fire in here without a lot of oxygen. Oxygen. HVAC. Where were the damn controls for this level? He continued walking to the lip of the circular room, and the whispering sound increased as though his presence had excited the alien growth. The thick arms on the bulkheads all reached in his direction, even from the far bulkhead some 50 meters away. Zilf paused. Now that he was closer, he realized one of the growths, 4 meters away, clinging to the bulkhead, wasn't a ton or a thick clump, but a console that had been completely covered by the kudzu. He glanced nervously at the sets of arms reaching toward him from several meters up the bulkhead. They couldn't get him. Could they? He wasn't taking the chance. He knelt and crouch-walked the 5 meters to the overgrown workstation, the squelch of the flora beneath his boots making him nauseous, while the hiss and whisper of everything breathing around him increased in both volume and rapidity. The div is excited for its next meal, his father's voice said in his mind. The entire station was a nest of divs, creatures that didn't care what they were chasing, what hazards might lie in wait. They wanted only to eat and eat, or transform you. The thought left him cold. The thick growth crawled over his boots with every step, his legs' tactile sensors telling him he was wrapped up in something. Rather than look down and be shocked at the sight, he kept moving with little resistance, but there was some. He'd have to watch for more than just the large arms reaching for him. If he got too close to the thick growth on the bulkhead, it might manage to snare him, trap him, and slowly lift him upward to the waiting claws of those creepily human-like appendages. When he finally reached the base of the console, he activated the plasma torch, kept it to a low flame, and dragged it a full centimeter away from the growth. The flora crawled away from the plasma, the tendrils hurriedly retreating further into the bulkhead, and finally revealing the holo display. The room sighed heavily as though in pain or frustration. He glanced upward and saw the arms straining to reach him. Ignoring them, but still wary, he activated the holo display, broke through the security lockout in seconds, and quickly scanned through the menus. He found what he was looking for: HVAC status. The system was unpowered, completely shut down. "Let's see if we can fix that," he told the display, and quickly tapped through another set of options, but didn't find what he was looking for. The HVAC controls had been completely locked out, probably by an annoyed administrator. Zilf tapped a greater than sign icon, dropped to the console, and entered commands. "Fire suppression stop, -T now." The system responded with, "Fire suppression system shutting down. Fire suppression offline." After a moment, he typed HVAC-config CH4:50 O2:100 CO2:purge restart. HVAC restarting. The periods moved like ants marching off a cliff, and all hell broke loose. Chapter 32. The deck vibrated as the HVAC system, probably buried in the module's infrastructure level, came to life. Fans in the ceiling and somewhere behind the growth covering the bulkheads started to spin. Oxygen flooded into the room, the flora shrieking in anger, pain, or surprise. Something smacked his helmet, and he looked up in time to see a shape hanging high above him. Correction. The ceiling was crawling with them, the hidden overheads barely providing enough ambient light for him to see their silhouettes. A glob of something came flying at him from the shadows, and he jerked to the side as it hit the deck. Zilf backed away from the console, and another ball of the gunk flew from the ceiling at him. 5 more followed, the last striking his shoulder like a baseball. The gobbet exploded and spattered in green goo that steamed off his armor. He stood to his full height and ran to the corridor. The deck vibrated beneath his feet, and he saw what he'd feared. The creatures clinging to the ceiling were falling to the deck. In a moment or two, he might be facing dozens of the things. He didn't have much time, and he knew it. Portions of the bulkheads fluttered, the tendrils angrily sweeping aside as white fog flowed past them. The oxygen, lighter than CO2, would float higher and higher until it met the layers of methane, creating a sandwich with CO2 CH4 bread slices, delicious oxygen in the middle. The slice of CO2, however, was rapidly being eaten by the purge. The creatures made their way to the corridor's lip, their sphincter-like mouths puckering to fling more projectiles at him. Zilf lifted the bolt gun, knowing damn well it would neither be accurate nor have enough force to more than scratch the creatures, and fired the remaining bolts. The tool belched with each pull, the creatures reacting to the noise before the bolts flew past them. The nearest creature caught a bolt in its face, shrieked, and scuttled around the corner. The others in the center of the room looked confused, unsure if he was a threat. The only way the room would burn is if there was enough oxygen to methane ratio in the ceiling. Since the purging system was pulling atmosphere from the deck, his HUD showed the CO2 levels dropping, the oxygen increasing. Zilf pulled the last bandolier, reloaded the bolt gun, and placed it in his non-tool hand. He pulled the last welding fuel canister and activated the glove's magnetics. The canister locked to his open palm like a strange tumor. The creatures had decided he was more a meal than a threat, and had started to advance. The spindly-legged things joined by the long, segmented tardigrade-type creatures, and something else that had far too many legs, tails, and eyes for him to make much sense of. 2 acronyms from training flitted across his mind. Fear, fuck everything and run. GTFO, get the fuck out. Not running or getting out, he said aloud before grinning and activating his external speakers. "Shark eats!" he screamed and rushed forward. The creatures, startled either by the sound of his speakers or the sight of the fully lit, massive suit running at them, paused one beat too long. As Zilf ran by the first, he fired a bolt into its head and quickly shot a second. The three on his left had come to their senses, and a projectile flew past him, the sounds of too many legs squishing the flora barely imprinting on his consciousness. The hatch was still far, but he wasn't going for it. Instead, he drifted slightly to the left, firing the bolt gun blindly at the creatures on his flank. When the bolt gun hit empty, he tossed it to the deck, pulled the canister from his tool hand, and threw it. The canister dazzled in his lights as it flew 10 meters in the air. He activated the targeting for his torch, and the moment the canister reached its zenith, he fired twice. The first shot whizzed by the canister and struck the upper portion of the room, the flora exploding into flame. The second only clipped the canister, but that was more than enough. Flaming liquid spread in all directions as if from a Molotov cocktail. The room screamed and fire spread across the bulkheads, the liquid falling back to the deck and setting it ablaze. The heavy oxygen concentration at the top of the room, coupled with the methane, combusted. The room briefly turned into a fireball before becoming a whirlwind of flame. Zilf turned, pulled the wrench, and hit the nearest burning creature in the skull. The thing danced and jittered in pain, its spindly legs wildly stamping as they fried. Zilf, protected from the fire by the suit, continued through the room, smashing and bashing the already dying creatures. The fire was too much, the oxygen concentration too high, and the HVAC kept feeding the fire with more oxygen. Clouds of steam and smoke obscured the top of the room, but Zilf knew it was all burned. The floor in the room had turned a deep brown where it hadn't been completely destroyed. The fireball had killed most of it, the flames finishing it off. Zilf stood in the center of the room, armor glowing from the heat, and surveyed the area. No creatures moved. Even the all-too-human arms that had stuck out from the bulkheads had combusted, leaving no sign behind. The fire continued swirling, the HVAC system roaring for all it was worth, the methane used up and now pure O2 burned the entire room. Feeling like a djinn, a being of fire and smoke, Zilf walked through the blaze to the melted console. The holo display was no doubt dead, but the interface was still active. He found it, connected to it, and shut down the HVAC system. The fire continued blazing for a moment before the remaining O2 completely burned up. All sound died in the room as the system vented the atmosphere, Zilf's HUD warning him he was now in vacuum. Smiling, he reset the HVAC, the fire suppression systems, and restarted. Zilf slowly rotated, his eyes scanning the ceiling for possible threats coming through those vents. Nothing. He heaved a huge sigh and stepped forward, happy to hear his boots striking metal rather than squelching flora. "Now I have a redoubt," he said aloud, voice echoing through the external speakers. Blushing, he killed the externals and walked to the central hatch. The holo controls had been completely melted by the fire, but he didn't need them. The manual release worked fine. The bolt gun was wasted. The fire had melted the tool, making it inoperable, and he didn't have any ammunition left for it anyway. Nor did he have any plasma fuel. With only 1% remaining, he couldn't fire plasma blasts. He'd be lucky if he could make starter cuts on a bulkhead before having to smash his way through them. Cutter gone, bolt gun the same, no plasma fuel. He was down to 2 wrenches, fists, feet, and his remaining non-lethal engineering tools. Zilf pulled the spare wrench and held it in one hand before putting his own in the other. He felt ridiculous wielding both at the same time. Destroying the flora and fauna inside this room had given him new life, but it was fading. What was behind this hatch? Another corridor of growth with more arms, maybe this time at waist height, waiting to grab him and tangle him and cut through his suit? "Shark swims," Zilf muttered, and activated the manual release. The hatch, still hot enough to burn human skin, swung open, Zilf ready to swing his non-tool hand at anything that tried to get through. He needn't have worried. Apart from the vents in the ceiling, the corridor beyond contained no growth. Several of the grates had been popped, dried stalactites of goo hanging from their edges. The deck directly below the vents had patches of the alien flora, but they didn't seem to be spreading. Zilf wondered why. According to the suit's sensors, the atmosphere here was fine for humans. The HVAC system must have purged the entire level rather than just the cylindrical room. Good. He wasn't about to remove his helmet, but he thought that maybe the high oxygen concentrations had a deleterious effect on the creatures. The things on the bulkhead had certainly reacted to the atmosphere change before he set everything on fire. Multiple hatches lined the corridor, although the left side had more than the right. Without the growth, the signs were easy to make out. Medical, comms, module engineering. Zilf felt something he hadn't in a while. Hope. He made his way to the comms hatch while hugging the bulkhead. Atmosphere or no atmosphere, he didn't trust the vents. At any moment, something might drop down, and without fuel or explosives, he'd have to bash it to death. The memory of the whip-appendaged monstrosity in Station 2 was still with him, as was the wet thwap of those projectiles. He touched the stud and the hatch opened at once. No security system whatsoever. A bank of red status lights flashed in the otherwise pitch-dark room. After panning his lights around to ensure nothing hid in the shadows, he checked the ceiling, found more open vents, and silently cursed. The comms control consoles stood at the far wall, the bank's status lights blinking out of sync in a time signature only they knew. Mindful of the vent, he attached the spare wrench to his tool arm and headed for the banks. The first connection attempt failed, as did the second. The next hack attempt, however, brought up the holodisplay and a series of statuses. The system had been locked out, of course, after the Station 3 sysop or someone who'd cracked the admin accounts had shut it down. He dropped to the console, fed in a slew of commands, and saw what he was hoping for. Connection successful. Command? Grinning, Zilf told the comms to restart. It thought for a moment. Reserve power active. QE comms on standby. Well, he thought, so much for a long conversation. Without a properly functioning reactor, any QE comms would rapidly drain the reserves. Based on the levels the system reported, he figured he'd have time for a 30-second conversation at best. Instead of activating the power-hungry system, he chose instead to set up a station-wide frequency scan. Each level that still had functional sensors and transmitters pinged for active, open comms. The report came back with 1. Zilf quickly compared the address ID to that of Griggs and Harvey. Harvey's ID matched. Level 10. A schematic appeared on the holodisplay, quickly zooming in on the location. Poseidon. He queried the location for a description of the large area, but there was none available. It had been a long shot anyways, but he thought maybe, just maybe, Station 3 would have the standard options. It was far too much to hope for on a Crimson-level station. He ran a search for Griggs's comm traffic, another hope against hope that the system had recorded any transmissions from his suit. No log for him. As far as Station 3 was concerned, Griggs had never entered the facility. Harvey's, on the other hand, showed up in glowing detail. According to the logs, Harvey had traveled from level 4 just as Zilf had, and descended to the bottom of the station, or what Zilf had thought was the bottom of the station. The lifts had said level 10 was the last, but Harvey was on 11. Frowning, he dropped to the console again and queried for suit IDs rather than comm IDs for the last hour. 3 results appeared. Zilf, Harvey, and Griggs, Zilf said. He ran another query for Griggs's movements and frowned again. According to the query, Griggs was on this level, so why hadn't his comms showed up on Zilf's HUD? Suit malfunction? He had to find Griggs. Harvey could wait. But before he left the room, he had one more thing to try. Reki. He needed to talk to Reki. Station 3 couldn't possibly connect to Station 2 since it no longer existed, but the system should be able to communicate with Station 1. Zilf activated the station-to-station comms, searched for Reki's ID, and found it. With a sigh of relief, he stabbed the connect button floating before him and waited. And waited. And waited. The good feeling he'd had a moment ago departed like a dream. Had something happened in Station 1? After a few more seconds, he started another connection and used Li Zhao's ID. More seconds ticked off, the comms interface flashing with 2 status messages. Waiting for connection. Connection unavailable. The rest of his team wasn't answering. He had a bad feeling about that. Reki would never turn off her comms, and neither would Li Zhao. So why weren't they answering? One more shot, he thought. Instead of searching for suits, he queried the orbitals for a connection, found a path to Station 1, and connected via command line. Another query, and he found the EET dropship comms. With a deep breath, he stabbed the connect button. A moment later, he got a connection successful.
Zilf!
Wilk's voice rang out.
You're in Station 3?
Affirmative. I've lost all comms with the rest of the EET. You have a sit rep? Long pause followed before Wilkes responded.
Station 1 is a loss. Station 2 is all but gone, and I have no idea about Station 3. You tell me about that one.
Where's Reki? Another pause.
Reki and Li Xiao are no longer responding on comms. Reki hasn't even attempted a QE connection in the last hour or so.
Last hour? How long had he, Yuri, and Griggs been gone? Certainly more than an hour. Do you have orders? Zilf asked. From command, I mean. No pause this time, but Wilkes' voice sounded a little shaky.
Station 3 is to be destroyed. All remaining non-EET personnel are to be terminated. Once you've finished your mission, you're to head to Station 3's orbital lift.
Copy orbital lift, Zilf said. Tell command we have at least 1 KIA and 4 MIA. 5 if you count Harvey.
You haven't found Harvey yet?
Wilkes asked. He sounded awake and engaged now. Why was that? I know his location, Zilf said. I'll be tracking him down soon.
If you can, incapacitate him and bring him with you.
Zilf raised an eyebrow. Why? Wilkes said flatly.
Orders.
The sound of Zilf's grinding teeth seemed to echo in his helmet. Copy. Extract Harvey, but Wilkes, how are we getting off the orbital?
My problem,
He said.
Just get there so we can get the fuck out of this system.
Copy. I'm leaving the comm system open and we'll get a patch running. As long as the power reserves last, you should be able to get to me.
Copy. I'll try and keep the chatter to a minimum.
Zilf out. He terminated the connection but left the receiver tied to his suit comms. If Wilkes or someone else tried to use Station 3's comms, he'd be able to hear them and hopefully find them.